So the physics of the vid. Claude Shannon talked about information. He's probably the best standard theory about information. He talked about he developed information theory and applied it to thermodynamics. In quantum physics, they talked about quantum non-locality, the observer, virtual particles, and quantum flux in the vacuum. I mean, things get really weird in the quantum world. So why not virtual information in the quantum world? Jack Sarfati is an eccentric physicist up in San Francisco. Anyone here know him? Okay. He has big websites and email lists and everything. He's quite something. And he talks about qubits and post-quantum physics. And William Tiller, who's my sponsor, emeritus professor at Stanford, he talks about he talks about multiple dimensions, but how there's an inverse space, which is like a Fourier transform of this space. And he comes up with lots of examples that seem to support that. There are lots of physicists who talk about multiple dimensions. There are physicists who talk about string theory. I could see virtual information existing in those domains too. I mean, just recently they talk about, they developed some data about muons, and it destroys the standard model of physics. So really anything could happen in physics, anything. But I'm not a good theoretical physicist, and so I leave this to other people. I'm just working on the bigger picture. Here's the way I like to visualize the vid. Here's the world that we focus on, the material system in the matter and energy world. And if you zoom in on it, it's fantastic. There are all kinds of details. I mean, it's fascinating. But what I'm saying is that there's this Vidic world, and in it are Vidic correlates to the physical systems, and I think it's much bigger. For instance, I mean, there are many more relations between atoms than there are atoms. And then I suppose that there's the possibility of systems that exist separate from matter and energy and are actually engulfed in the vid, wherever it is. Another way to visualize the vid, this is an intuitive way, but in comics they talk about, we have these thought balloons, and I think it's a really great model for what our inner process is, because we have the vid inside us too, I think, proposing that in a way it's almost like having a desktop. And Bernard Bars, who I saw at the Consciousness Conference, he talks about a sort of a conscious workspace, and it looks a lot like this desktop that I'm working on, with icons and windows, and in a way that's sort of what it's like to be a human being. You can change topics, change subjects. You can call up different routines. I mean, it's interesting. So here's some properties of the vid and Vidic systems that I'm inferring from the different anomalies and some hunches. It's vaster than the material world. Remember the Vidic iceberg. The material world is just the top of the iceberg. It interacts with matter and energy. It may actually underlie and create matter or the material world. I think it's the substrate for thought, logic, consciousness, and experience. I think it's the substrate for a lot of biological information. It's highly but flexibly structured and organized. It's self-organizing, hierarchical. In the complex system, people would really love this. It's unlimited by space and time. It's everywhere and every when. It's unlimited by matter and energy. It's unlimited by size. Again, the angel's on the head of the pin. I mean, maybe there's some limit down, where the dimensions interact, but I don't know. For all intents and purposes, size doesn't make any difference. There's unlimited storage of information, bandwidth, computation capacity, and networking. These are inferences. I can't prove it, but I suspect it. One thing that there's a lot of evidence for is that it's programmable, whatever it is, by conscious intent. That it speaks your language, and that it's friendly. So Sun Microsystems says that the network is the computer. I say the vid is the computer. It's intelligent, it's everywhere and every when, it's capable, conscious, friendly, and it's waiting. So let's get into some of the anomalies and explanations. And I'm really going to rush through this because there are a lot of them. These are the unsolved mysteries. And we go in genomics. This was in the New York Times on Tuesday, in the Science Times. A short, junky surprise. This is the human genome. It's very short. There are only 31,000 genes, and and they're expecting that those 31,000 genes are going to explain our bodies, how they work, our physiology, our biochemistry, our behavior, our instincts, our psyche. I don't think so. So I think the Vidic hypothesis could actually take us a leap further. I think I'm just proposing that most of the biological information is actually on the vid. Remember the iceberg. We're looking at the genome here, but the Vidic genome is much vaster, much more complex, much more developed. So most genes actually are just templates for the protein factories in the body. The junk DNA, I think that's the interesting place to work. I think those may be antennas or they may be pointers into a big Vidic database, wherever it is. It's everywhere. Evolution, actually, I think, I've always looked at it, it looks to me like there are just too many variables evolving over too short a period of time to get us, to get birds, to get whatever. Perhaps the vid is actually a database, or there's some actual mechanisms going on there. I don't know, I'm waving my hands. Embryo development. No one really knows yet where the blueprint is for the embryo. And yet they develop, different species, human beings. How is it controlled? Well, there are some biomechanical and biochemical, molecular biological mechanisms, but I think that they may not be the whole story. Perhaps we'll find answers in the vid. In molecular biology, I think this is well known, that the ligands and receptors bind much faster than would be predicted by Brownian motion. Shall we look in the vid for that? I don't know. In brain and neuroscience, I used to work in a neuroscience lab at the University of Arizona. I used to talk about some of these ideas, and they didn't want to hear it. But no one knows. This is one of those things that they don't like to talk about very much. But they don't know where memory is. They don't know where perception is. They don't know where consciousness is. And they don't know where experience is. I mean, they think that all we are is just machines that have neurons firing. And that's not how we live, and that's not how we experience. There's much more going on, I think. Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose talk about how microtubules may be acting as quantum transducers within the neurons. Maybe that's a possible, maybe it's not just going between neurons, but is also being a transducer into the vid. Now, an interesting piece of evidence also is that Carl Pribram, who used to be at Stanford, now is in Virginia, when he maps out the way that perceptions, visual, tactile, etc., are mapped on the cortex, it's not a simple map. It's actually a hologram. It's actually a Fourier transform of what the map you would expect to be. So this might fit in with Professor Tiller's idea of the inverse universe, that maybe the information is in that, in the inverse space. Okay, SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. They haven't found them yet. It's mysterious. Why not? Well, maybe they haven't pointed at the right star, or maybe electromagnetic communication becomes obsolete rather quickly in the history of the civilization. Maybe almost everyone else is using the vid, using Vidic technology for communication. So here's the book, William Tiller, my advisor. It's called Science and Human Transformation, Subtle Energies, Intentionality, and Consciousness. And he has many different anomalies in here that he talks about, and he's done many experiments, and these are things that cannot be explained by the standard paradigm. He also in the book develops the physics framework, and he talks about the inverse space that I was talking about earlier. So here's some photographs that I scanned out from his book. This is just one example of an anomaly. These two pictures were taken by two cameras mounted on a metal bar, and they were taken simultaneously. And sorry, it didn't scan very well, but it's an auditorium like this, so you can see the people and hear the lights and stuff. But in this camera, which was imprinted by the intention from this guy who has this ability to do that, you see streaks coming out of the lights. I mean, these were mounted on the same bar. You see all sorts of other weird things in the photograph in the original. Here's some more photos that he took. These were taken in Memorial Church at Stanford, and you can see the stained glass windows. But what you don't see is that both of these pictures, according to Professor Tiller, were taken through the lens cap. So what a complex process that is. Is it light that's going through, or is it that intentionality sets up some sort of mapping that creates a geometry and then somehow triggers those little film grains to flip? Tiller is still working, and he's been focusing lately on intention imprinted devices. He takes a little electronic box and he focuses intention in this in a special way, and he's found that this can actually change the pH of water. It can change the temperature of air. He's done some experiments with fruit flies and also with liver enzymes, and they all work. He sees changes according to the intention that's imprinted in the device, and he sees more effects as the lab space is actually worked in over a longer period of time. Another thing he's noticed is that there's an oscillation both in time and in space, sort of like the Fourier transform that we were talking about earlier. If you take a simple system and look at it in the Fourier transform, it turns into waves, and vice versa. There was a scientist named Marcel Vogel who used to work at IBM and used to live in San Jose. He had what he called the Psychic Research Laboratory after he retired, so he could do what he really wanted to do. He was working on imprinting thought forms into crystals, quartz crystals, and programming these crystals so that they would actually do things in the physical world, like changing pH, changing chemistry, and changing the taste of wine. He was doing experiments like that. There's a place called the Boundary Institute, also here in Silicon Valley. I mean, this is a hotbed of materialism, but it's a hotbed of all this other stuff, too. Dean Radin, who I don't know if he's still the president of the Parapsychology Institute, but that's his URL. He talks about how conscious intent, well, he's done experiments showing that conscious intent can actually modify random number generators, even in the past, even in the future. And he has some experiments that you can run right on the website. It's fascinating. I've played around with it, and sometimes I score high, sometimes I score low. He's also done some experiments, and these are very well documented, where he hooks people up to biological monitors and shows them pictures on a screen of different things. And he finds that the body actually responds a third of a second before the randomly chosen picture of a venomous snake about to pounce or something scary shows up on the screen. So the body actually knows before something happens that it's going to happen. Then there's the PAIR lab, and it's the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Lab in Princeton. This has been there for a long time. Robert John, they also have been doing the random number generator experiments, and they have some experiments on the web, so you can practice your psychokinesis. He also has found that these things work better in conditioned space, where someone has done rituals, or they have focused a lot of intent in there for a long period of time. So it's very similar to what Tiller was talking about. There's quite a bit of research going on about remote healing and prayer. Elizabeth Card, who's up in, I think, in the Berkeley area, has been showing, remarkable results and very significant statistically, that people actually, by intention, can help someone get better, even if they don't know the person's name, if they're just chosen randomly, and even if they don't know where that person is.